Idi Amin. The dictator who declared himself King of Scotland, he gave himself titles nobody else recognized: Conqueror of the British Empire, King of Scotland, and awarded himself medals for wars he never fought. World leaders laughed at him in private and were terrified of him in person. While the international press treated him as a bizarre, almost comic figure, he was overseeing the deaths of an estimated 300,000 of his own citizens. Idi Amin seized power in Uganda through a military coup in 1971, overthrowing the country's existing government while its president was traveling abroad, and quickly consolidated authority through a combination of genuine early popularity, driven partly by public relief following years of increasingly authoritarian rule under his predecessor, and a rapidly escalating campaign of political violence, specifically targeting anyone Amin perceived as a genuine or potential threat to his own consolidating power. What made Amin genuinely, distinctively unusual among history's authoritarian rulers wasn't simply the scale of violence his regime ultimately inflicted, substantial as that violence proved, but the specific, often genuinely bizarre public persona he simultaneously cultivated on the international stage, adopting an extensive, self-awarded list of formal titles including His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC DSO MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and Conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular, a title he formally used in official government correspondence and public appearances, along with periodically making genuinely bizarre, widely reported public statements, including formally declaring himself King of Scotland in solidarity with Scottish nationalist movements, a claim entirely disconnected from any genuine political reality or recognition, but one that received considerable, often genuinely amused international media coverage throughout the 1970s. This specific combination, genuinely severe, documented human rights atrocities occurring simultaneously alongside a public international persona, frequently treated by Western media and popular culture as eccentric or even comic, created a genuinely significant documented pattern in which the actual severity of Amin's domestic policies received considerably less sustained international attention and diplomatic pressure than the scale of the violence would otherwise have warranted, since international audiences, and to a genuine documented extent several Western governments, appeared to treat Amin substantially as an object of bemused fascination rather than a leader overseeing genuinely catastrophic sustained domestic violence. The actual scale of violence within Uganda during Amin's roughly 8-year rule proved genuinely catastrophic, with historians and human rights organizations studying the period generally estimating between 100,000 and 300,000 Ugandans killed through a combination of direct political execution, ethnic violence specifically targeting certain communities Amin viewed as disloyal or threatening, and broader state-sanctioned violence carried out through Amin's secret police and military intelligence apparatus. A genuinely wide estimated range, reflecting the significant documentation challenges inherent in studying mass violence within a country where formal record-keeping had been severely compromised throughout the period of violence itself. Amin's regime specifically targeted several distinct groups throughout his rule, including political rivals and perceived threats within his own government and military, intellectuals and professionals whose independent thinking Amin viewed as potentially threatening to his authority, and specific ethnic communities, including a particularly severe, documented campaign against the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups, communities associated with Amin's immediate military predecessor, subjected to sustained, systematic violence throughout Amin's rule. Amin's regime also carried out a genuinely significant, internationally documented economic and demographic disruption in 1972, when he ordered the mass expulsion of Uganda's entire Asian population, predominantly individuals of Indian and Pakistani descent whose families had lived in Uganda for generations and who controlled a genuinely disproportionate share of the country's commercial and business sector, an expulsion Amin justified through explicitly discriminatory rhetoric and carried out with minimal preparation time, forcing tens of thousands of people to abandon homes, businesses and property, with little opportunity for orderly departure, a policy that produced immediate severe damage to Uganda's broader economy, given the sudden loss of the specific commercial expertise and capital this expelled population had represented. Amin's international relationships throughout his rule reflected genuinely significant Cold War-era geopolitical complexity, receiving military and economic support at various points from multiple foreign governments pursuing their own strategic interests within the broader Cold War competition for African political alignment. Support that continued, in several documented instances, even as increasingly credible reports of Amin's domestic atrocities became more widely known internationally, a pattern of continued external support despite documented human rights concerns that historians studying the period generally regard as reflecting broader, systemic Cold War-era foreign policy priorities that frequently subordinated human rights concerns to immediate strategic and geopolitical calculations. Amin's rule ultimately ended in 1979, following a Tanzanian military invasion launched substantially in response to an earlier, failed Ugandan attempt to annex Tanzanian territory, a conflict that provided the Tanzanian government both genuine strategic justification and international political cover to pursue a full military campaign specifically aimed at removing Amin from power, an invasion that succeeded within several months, forcing Amin to flee Uganda entirely, eventually settling in exile in Saudi Arabia, where he lived, according to most historical accounts, in genuine, comfortable, unpunished exile for the remainder of his life, dying in 2003 having never faced any formal legal accountability or prosecution for the atrocities committed during his rule. What makes Amin's rule endure as one of history's most significant examples of authoritarian violence obscured by public spectacle isn't simply the scale of documented atrocities themselves, genuinely catastrophic as that scale remains, but the specific, well-documented way his genuinely bizarre, frequently entertaining public persona created a persistent, damaging international perception gap. A leader whose formal titles and eccentric public statements generated considerably more sustained international media attention and cultural memory than the actual, catastrophic human cost of his domestic policies ever received during his rule itself. A pattern that historians studying the specific dynamics of international media coverage and authoritarian leadership continue examining as a genuinely instructive case study in exactly how spectacle and genuine atrocity can coexist without receiving proportionate international scrutiny. If stories like this, where a dictator's absurd public theatre somehow overshadowed the actual scale of the horror happening behind it, are exactly what you come here for, subscribe to The Grave Details, because history holds more stories like this than most people will ever know.